Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our History of War. This is the third episode of our accelerated series, 11 Critical Battles. Today we're looking at the Siege of Arpad, 743 BCE. Now, if your education was anything like mine, you've probably never heard of the Siege of Arpad, but you probably have heard of the Assyrians, the people who conquered the city. They've been around for a pretty long time by 743 BCE, even done some conquering themselves. But today they're going to start building the empire that made them famous. Today's battle and the king who fought it are probably the reason you've heard of the Assyrians. So let's take a look at them first. The first time we saw the Assyrians in this show was during the reign of Hammurabi of Babylon. If you remember, Hammurabi tried to bring the Assyrians into his empire in about 1750 BCE, shortly before he died, but he couldn't make it happen. He might have been too old, or his health was too poor, or he was just tired of campaigning by then, but the Assyrians remained beyond Hammurabi's reach. They didn't do much in the next few hundred years, mostly keeping to themselves. And then, sometime around 1200 BCE, the game changed. How'd the game change? Well, it started with a little event called the Bronze Age collapse. Now, nobody really knows what the Bronze Age collapse was, or what caused it, or why it happened when it did. It used to be pretty common to blame the invasion of somebody called the Sea Peoples, but it's hard to imagine the level of disruption we see among the great powers of the late Bronze Age as the result of anything less than a huge wave of migration. Yes, new peoples came in, and some of them fought with the peoples of Egypt and the Levant, and some of the Egyptian inscriptions talk about them and name them the Sea Peoples. But the empires of Egypt and the Hittites should have been strong enough to absorb any migration coming in from the sea. You just can't move that many people fast enough to really disrupt an empire of that size, unless you're coming also overland. I've also heard a few historians say it was climate change that caused the collapse. This is a little more plausible. If the climate warmed up significantly in an area that was already pretty hot, it could really mess things up for the powers trying to run things. Because when the climate changes, it changes the growing season, or maybe even the kinds of crops that can grow in a region. And when that happens, people starve. And there's not a damn thing that government can do about it unless they've had the foresight to start putting away grain for the last several years, which they may or may not have done. And climate change forces people to migrate from one area into another as their own crops fail. This is going to put pressure on the crops in the region they migrate to as the population goes up sharply in a short period, which means people starve from both groups. And once again, the government can't do a damn thing about it except try to force the new group out, in which case they're going to fight back, which could very well destabilize the ruling system if the group of new arrivals is big enough. So that could explain it. Climate change all around the Mediterranean and probably parts of Europe and Central Asia as well, which caused people to try to get their families to the well-known wealthy kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, which caused those kingdoms to stagger and then collapse under the pressure. And even if it's hard to figure out what caused the collapse, it's easier to trace its effects. The Egyptian and the Hittite empires took it on the chin. The Hittites pretty much contracted into a small kingdom in the Levant, and the Egyptians managed to hold on to the Nile Valley but lost their territories in Canaan and Nubia. The Assyrians held on to what they had, a small area on the east bank of the Tigris, and the Babylonians managed to keep control of southern Mesopotamia. It looks like the Elamites also managed to hold on to the east coast of the Persian Gulf. But the effect that might have been even more important, the one that really forced the game to change, was that the trade routes between the Fertile Crescent and Central Asia were disrupted. Hard. What does that mean? Well, you remember how we've been saying the Bronze Age was only possible because the kingdoms of the Fertile Crescent could get tin from modern-day Afghanistan? Yeah, with that trade cut off, These kingdoms that grew up as the masters of bronze, whose economies and military systems were both based on bronze, suddenly couldn't get it anymore. Things that make you go, shit. So you can get by for a while with the stuff you have, and you can recast and refurbish broken weapons and tools. But if you can't get more, you're pretty much stuck with what you already have, which makes it hard to field an army big enough to protect yourself against your neighbors. They needed to find a new metal. And with the Bronze Age collapse, the Iron Age began. So what's the big deal about iron anyway? Well, it turns out pure iron really isn't any better for weapons or tools than bronze. In fact, it's a good deal worse. Iron is soft, so it deforms easily, and a spearhead that bends when you try to stick it in the poor bastard in front of you isn't worth the fuck. Bronze, by contrast, hardens as you work it, which means you can make a spearhead that won't deform when you stick the aforementioned poor bastard. Iron is also much harder to get out of the rocks than either copper or tin. You can make an open-air bonfire hot enough to smelt copper and tin and cast them into bronze. But to make a fire hot enough to smelt and work iron, you have to get a little creative. You can do it with wood if you have lots of it and you have a way to force air into the base of the flames to get it hot. Pretty sure the technical blacksmith term here is really fucking hot. Better to use charcoal, and even better to use coal that's been burned once to make coke. But as far as I know, neither of these would be available for a few hundred years yet. But if you can figure out how to get your fire hot enough, you get to take advantage of the huge advantage iron gives you over bronze. It's everywhere. Much more plentiful as metals go than tin, and even more abundant than copper. And if you can get your fire hot enough, you can take advantage of another advantage iron gives you. Mix it with a little bit of carbon, and you get a new alloy, steel. But where our last alloy, bronze, required metals from all over the world to make, steel just requires iron and carbon. And you know where carbon comes from? Wipe your finger across a piece of burned wood. Wait till it cools off first. That black stuff that comes off on your finger, that's carbon. So in the process of smelting and heating and hammering, you can accidentally introduce enough carbon into your iron to make it into steel. Do that a few times or a few hundred times, and you start to figure out that your weapons actually come out better if you let them get dirty in the fire. And steel is better than bronze for weapons. Much better. So you have a source of iron, and you have guys who know how to work it into steel. You just acquired the means to equip an army bigger than anything that's come before with better weapons and armor. And guess who knew how to do that better than just about anybody else in Mesopotamia? That's right, the Assyrians. So the Assyrians first pushed out into an empire in the 12th century BCE under a king called Tiglath-Pileser I. His empire, like most of the empires we've looked at, didn't survive him for very long. But it looks like iron weapons really caught on in the 9th century BCE when Shalmaneser III fielded an army of something like 70,000 guys. But we're not here to talk about Tiglath-Pileser I or Shalmaneser III today. Today we're talking about the guy who really kicked off the Assyrian Empire, Tiglath-Pileser III. So first of all, it looks like this guy usurped the throne. Historians seem to think he was legitimately of royal blood, maybe a brother or a brother-in-law or a cousin, but wasn't in line for the throne when a palace coup overthrew his successor, Ashur-Nirari V, in about 746 BCE. It's not clear whether he was the instigator of the coup, but if it walks like a duck. Anyway, his name was Pulu, and he was the governor of the Assyrian capital of Nimrud until he took the throne. Clearly, he took the name Tiglath-Pileser so he could maybe start off with a little better name recognition. But pretty soon, it didn't matter, because this guy immediately started to build the Assyrian army into an invincible machine. He started by making sure no other ambitious and talented motherfucker could come up behind him and do what he had done. He broke up the existing territories inside his kingdom, increasing the number of regional governors from 12 to 25, which meant each one was that much less powerful than he had been. And he started replacing the governors with eunuchs of his own choosing. Now, a eunuch, if you didn't know, is a dude just like any other dude, except he's had, well, let's just say he's had a little work done. He's had his nuts cut off. So Tiglath-Pileser III, one of my sources calls him TP3, so I'm going to start doing that, even though he would probably hate it. Anyway, TP3 didn't have to worry about governors standing up their own little dynasties anymore. Anytime one died, he would just replace him with another eunuch. So now that his rule was secure, he started changing the way the army served. Most of the armies in the Middle East were made up of farmer levies, which meant they were only available from harvest to planting, or from planting to harvest. And probably not both unless the shit really hit the fan. TP3 shit-canned that system, replacing it with what might have been the world's first professional standing army. Each province was responsible for sending him a number of men whose only job would be soldiering. That's what they did year-round. And he gave them iron weapons and shields of tightly woven reeds and iron caps and tunics covered with iron plates and chariots and horses and composite bows. And he made sure to issue them something most generals of his day would have overlooked. He gave them boots. Boring, I know, especially in our world where just about every one of us has a different pair of shoes for every occasion. But think about the way these armies fought. A campaign might require a soldier to walk several hundred miles across hard ground, maybe sandy or dusty, maybe through gravel or tough vegetation. We think of these people wearing sandals everywhere they went, and sandals are okay for protecting the bottom of the foot when you don't need to move too fast. But what do you do when a little piece of gravel or a nut or a thorn gets between your foot and your sandal? At best, that's going to slow you down as you try to clear it out. And an army on the move isn't going to want to slow down to wait on you. So you either fall out and catch up when you can, fall out and fall in with the next unit back, or ignore it until the irritation becomes an injury. The first two options are going to fuck up unit cohesion. The third is going to take the soldier out of the fight. And a soldier who can't fight because he can't walk is just as ineffective as one with a spear in his gut. Except the guy who can't walk didn't have a chance to take another poor bastard out with him. So yeah, Assyrian boots were a big deal. Knee-high and made out of leather with an iron plate protecting the shin, these boots protected Tiglath-Pileser's guys from foot and ankle injuries, and even from cold weather injuries on the occasions when that might have been an issue. And they improved the soldiers' footing in rough terrain, which meant Assyrian armies could move at speed through areas other armies might have to pick their way across or even avoid completely. Of course, leather and iron up to the knee would have been heavy, and I'm sure the guys bitched and moaned about the boots and tried not to wear them on light marching days or when they felt secure. But they would have been glad of the extra protection all the same. In other words, TP3 built an army that had no excuse not to go where he pointed, and he gave them the best equipment he could get for them. And then he pointed them at the world. So that's Tiglath-Pileser III. What about the guys he was fighting? Well, the biggest pain in his ass was the kingdom of Urartu, led by a king called Sarduri II. Urartu occupied a crescent-shaped territory between Anatolia and Mesopotamia. It stretched from lands once held by Elam in the east to a big slice of what was once the Hittite Empire in the west. And Urartu had been pressing in on Assyria for years, trying to get a piece of the fertile heartland around Nimrod. And it looks like Sarduri may have been its greatest king for a little while. Hell, if it weren't for TP3, he probably would have been famous. Sarduri took the throne around 764 BCE, so he was already well established by the time TP3 came up. During Ashur-Nirari's reign, he had had some success pushing down into the Euphrates Valley at pretty much the extreme western end of Assyrian territory. He had some help from an ally in the region, a city called Arpad, which sat just a little north of modern-day Aleppo. I couldn't find out the name of the guy who ran the show in Arpad, but unfortunately for him, it's not going to matter much longer. This is going to be another one of those battles, actually 2 battles, that I'm going to have to pull out of my ass. So before I do that, I'll tell you what we know. It ain't much. TP3 turned first against Sharduri II and Urartu as the more serious threat. He met them in 743 BCE, somewhere near the city of Kumu, which sits near the modern-day border between Syria and Turkey. And the new Assyrian army showed Urartu what it was capable of. Sharduri survived. He would remain king of Urartu until 735 BCE. But as a threat to the Assyrians, he was done. TP3 drove him back up to the north side of the Euphrates, and by the time his reign ended, the crescent-shaped kingdom of Urartu that stretched from Syria to Iran and lay over the entire northern edge of Assyria had been pushed up toward the Caucasus Mountains and basically into modern-day Armenia, which incidentally traces its heritage back more or less to this period. So after TP3 beat Sharduri II at Kumu, he turned his amazing ass-kicking machine south to deal with one of Sharduri's key allies, the city of Arpad, capital of the kingdom of the same name. He lay siege to the city, and a short 3 years later, he destroyed it. No more Arpad. As a quick aside, how cool would TP3 and the amazing ass-kicking machine be as the title of like a 70s psychedelic rock album? I can imagine maybe David Bowie or The Who or Supertramp dropping an album like that. Anyway, that gets us into Tiglath-Pileser's real brilliance when it came to conquest, and the reason historians say he created the world's first true empire. See, the conquerors who came before TP3 knew how to kill people and throw down their cities and then rebuild them and put their own guys at the top to rule by their laws. And TP3 was certainly willing to use terror tactics like torture, mutilation, massacre, and desecration when it was the best way to get what he wanted. But TP3 figured out that in order for his empire to really stand the test of time, the people he conquered needed to think of themselves as Assyrians. So he identified people with valuable skills and he resettled them in other cities within his empire. But this was no Trail of Tears situation. Yes, he forced large groups of people to relocate from one place to another, but he subjected them to as little hardship as he could, providing animals and vehicles for those who couldn't walk the whole way, presumably moving the tools of those people with skills he needed, even matching men up with wives in some cases. Yes, he took away most of their choices, but instead of just putting his boot on their necks, he at least gave them a chance to do meaningful work and made sure they wouldn't be doing their meaningful work at his expense. So that's the bare bones of how TP3 built his empire. But how did he win all those battles? Well, for that, we're going to have to make some shit up. No shit. There they were. Before he could march against Urartu, TP3 needed to make sure his new army was properly broken in. So he started with a grand tour of cities that were already nominally under Assyrian control, but getting restless. And each time he took one of these cities, he would follow a calculated ritual. After publicly executing the leaders of the rebellion outside the city gates, he would ride in a triumphal procession through the city to the temple, where he would offer prayers and sacrifice to the city's patron god. Then he would elevate his chosen eunuch to the governorship, set some people on their way to some part of the empire that needed them, then turn around and march his army to the next rebellious town. That method took him slowly north and west from Nimrud, slowly enough that the rebellious cities in front of him got the message. The fights got easier as his triumph started to look more and more inevitable, until the last city just threw open its gates and surrendered their rebel leaders as soon as he drew his army up in front of the city. And after he had all of his own towns back under control, it was time to take on the beast to his north. But Sharduri wasn't worried about TP3. He knew damn well it was just a matter of time before this little Assyrian usurper bent the knee to him. After all, he had already beaten an Assyrian army under Ashur-Nirari V at Arpad only a decade or so earlier, sent their weak-ass king back to Nimrod with his tail between his legs. He thought he could stand against Sharduri, and Sharduri had beaten him so badly he hadn't dared to show himself for the rest of his reign. he would deal with this Tiglath-Pileser the same way. Well, TP3 didn't underestimate Sarduri in the same way. He was confident in his army's capabilities, knew they wanted payback for Arpad a decade ago, knew he could probably drive them north toward the Urartian capital and count on victory. But the real key to victory was going to be to crush Sarduri's army, and to do that, he would have to find it. Well, Urartu was as big as Assyria. If Sarduri didn't want to be found, he could hunt for months without ever bringing him to battle. And if he did it that way, Sarduri would get to pick the ground where they fought. So he decided to bring Sarduri to him. He marched his army, 50,000 strong, into the hinterland between Assyria and Urartu, making damn sure to kick up plenty of dust and commandeer plenty of aid and food from the Urartu side. Then he launched his troops across the border into Urartu proper, looking for undefended settlements and smaller towns. And for 2 months, he killed Sarduri's people and broke their toys and burned their towns and took them as his slaves. Well, no king can ignore that kind of thing for very long, and after 2 months of the Assyrians tearing hell out of his towns, Sarduri realized this was no raid but a full-ass invasion. TP3 was avoiding the larger cities, the ones with walls, but so far none of the local garrisons have been able to do anything about him. Now it looks like Sarduri was a man of, let's say, extreme confidence. He knew TP3 was nothing but a pain in the ass, and if he could bring him to battle and spank him, he could get rid of him, maybe for good. So he figured out where the Assyrians were, marched out at the head of his army, and offered battle on a broad plain near the city of Kumu. Now when we say an ancient army offered battle, what we mean is they found a piece of ground they wanted to fight on near the enemy. They formed up their army the way they wanted to fight, and they waited to see if the other guys would take the challenge. A lot of the time, the waiting would include taunting or displays of skill or toughness. A messenger might ride out to the enemy army to issue a formal challenge. The Spartans, who we'll get to here in a few episodes, like to pull up in battle formation, then drop their spears and shields, take off their helmets, and brush their hair right there on the battlefield to show the enemy just how little they thought of them. Their message was clear. Not only am I going to kick your ass, but I'm going to look damn good while I'm doing it. Now, I don't imagine Sarduri went so far as to have his men brush their hair. But there may have been other displays. Archery, chariotry, and horsemanship are probably 3 that made an appearance. There may have been some kind of martial dance or performance, something like the Maori Haka. And TP3 ignored the whole thing. He marched right past, making it very clear that he could see Sarduri's army drawn up and ready to fight, and he wasn't there for it. Not only was he not interested, he thought so little of the Urartian army that he was willing to let it hang out in his rear while he continued his invasion. Well, if there's anything a dude who's full of himself hates, it's to be ignored. So Sarduri picked up and marched right after the Assyrians, dead set now on tearing TP3 a new asshole. But of course TP3 wasn't really ignoring Sarduri. He was just luring him into a trap, because he had already picked the field he wanted to fight on, just a few miles from where Sarduri had drawn up. And most of his army was already there, with slingers and archers hidden in the rocks at the head of a shallow valley. So all his main force had to do was march into the valley and turn around, and there they were, ready for Sarduri to attack. And just to make sure Sarduri would take the bait, TP3 sent horse archers out to harass his forces as they marched in. Now, Assyrian horse archers were a little different than what you might be thinking of if you're familiar with the way the Parthians or the Huns or the Mongols or a dozen other horse cultures fought, because the Assyrians were still learning how to breed and ride and control their horses. The Assyrian horse archers would ride out in pairs, one guy holding the reins of both horses while the other loosed his arrows at the enemy. Then they would presumably trade off to keep from getting too tired. And of course, Sarduri took the bait. He formed up his army and charged. And the Assyrian infantry held against the charge. And for the slingers hidden in their elevated positions above the infantry line, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The Urartians tried to withdraw, but the Assyrian infantry pushed forward, keeping in contact and pushing with their iron spears. Before long, Sarduri's line was out of range for the slingers, but by then it didn't matter. Tiglath-Pileser's chariots and cavalry started nipping at the Urartians' flanks, and panic started to spread, and an orderly retreat became a rout. And the rout, as we've talked about before, is where most of the casualties happen. A terrified soldier who's trying to run away can't stick you with his spear, making it that much easier to stick him with yours. And his buddies are in his way, stopping him from running away until they can get turned around and run themselves. And you can imagine how long that might take when your formation is 20 ranks deep. When the guys in front turn to run, the guys in the back rank don't even know they're in danger yet. So trapped between their friends in front of them and the enemy behind them, the poor bastards from the front rank really don't have anything to do but die. That's how it might have happened at Kumu. We don't know how many guys were engaged or how many went down, and we know Sarduri survived. But it looks like his army was in no condition to interfere with the Assyrians' plans after the fight. So TP3 turned his attention south to the city of Arpad. He was happy with his army's performance so far, and they weren't done yet. Why Arpad? Because the people of Arpad, as we mentioned a minute ago, had allied with Sarduri 11 years earlier, when they had helped the Urartians kick the Assyrians' asses. That wasn't something Tiglath-Pileser was going to let go unpunished. But taking Arpad wasn't going to be as simple as just luring an enemy army into attacking on unfavorable ground. Arpad was a major city in northern Syria, with its own army and a big-ass wall designed to keep people from doing exactly the kind of thing Tiglath-Pileser wanted to do. And he had just fought a huge battle not far away. It wasn't like he was going to be able to sneak up on the city. So TP3 got to Arpad to find it locked up tight, with all the livestock and any ready crops already inside the walls. So he surrounded the city and settled in to wait it out. But of course, he didn't just wait for the people inside Arpad to starve. Because under TP3, the Assyrians developed the world's first corps of military engineers. And this was a great place for them to prove what they could do. Now, military engineers have two main purposes. First, they make it easier for their side to go where they want to go. In this case, that's into Arpad. And second, they make it harder for the enemy to go where they want to go. In the case of a walled city like Arpad, engineers have three choices to get friendly troops inside. They can go over the walls, under the walls, or through the walls. Over is usually the simplest option, but of course the enemy knows that. So they're going to do everything they can to stop you. They're going to drop things on you from the top of the wall. They're going to shoot arrows down at you. They're going to knock your ladders down when you try to put them up. That means you have to get more guys up over the wall faster than they can kill them, which means you need a lot of ladders, and you need to hit the wall in a lot of places at once, so they can't mass against you in one area. But of course your ladders need to be close enough together that the guys you throw over the wall aren't isolated from each other when they get in there. Under the wall is a lot harder and it's going to take a lot longer, but it's a little bit sneakier maybe. To get under the wall, you have to dig a tunnel under the foundations and up into the city. And your tunnel has to start far enough away from the wall that the guys on top of it can't see what you're doing and can't stop you if they do. And you really need more than one tunnel if you can manage it, because it's much harder for the enemy to stop guys pouring out of 2 tunnels or 3 than just one. And you need to synchronize when your tunnels break through so your enemy can't mass against each one individually as it opens. Or you need to coordinate your tunnel, your under attack, with an over attack so that your enemy is focused on both at one time. There's another way to get under the wall, and that's to undermine it. When you undermine a wall, you're not trying to get troops under it. You're trying to dig out enough of its support that a section collapses and your guys can climb in over the rubble. This usually involves setting up wooden braces to support the wall, then burning them when you're ready to attack. And your attacking force needs to be close enough that it can get through the breach quickly, but far enough out that the wall doesn't fall on them when it comes down, which might give your enemy time to throw some guys into the breach to repel you if you can't get there fast enough. And finally, you can go through the wall. Now, these Mesopotamian walls were usually between 10 and 20 feet thick and built out of mud brick. You can break through a mud brick wall faster than, say, a stone wall, but breaking through the main wall is not going to be a quick operation. You're much better off trying to break through some place where the wall isn't so thick, like a gate or a tower. But just like with the ladders, the enemy is going to do everything he can to stop you from breaking through, no matter where you go. He's going to shoot arrows at the guys manning your ram, or he's going to try to burn it, or he's going to sortie out when you're not looking and break it. And if you do manage to break through, he knows exactly where you're coming, and he's going to throw everything he has at the hole to try to keep you out. A good commander understands all that, or his engineers will help him understand it, and he's going to come up with a plan that gets his troops into the city while protecting them as well as possible. And a great way to do that is to go for a combination of breach points and to use something called a siege tower when you hit them. So what's a siege tower? Well, a siege tower is a tower on wheels, ideally about as tall, maybe a little bit taller than the wall you're trying to get over, that protects your guys in their most vulnerable position as they're approaching and climbing the wall. An Assyrian siege tower would have been constructed out of a wooden frame with a ladder or a stairway inside, covered with planks and probably tough skins on the outside to keep the enemy from shooting your guys as they climb. They also used another type of siege tower that had what looks like a ram sticking out the front of it. They would have used that ram to knock holes in the wall, probably in the thinner walls of towers, to provide an extra access point for the guys to get into the city. Putting the ram on a tower has the advantage of knocking the hole in a place where it's a little harder for your enemy to mass troops against you, because if you breach the wall of a tower into a hallway or a staircase, the guys inside can't bring their numbers to bear against your breach point. So a good portion of the 3 years of this siege probably would have been constructing these siege towers and training the guys to use them, as well as building ramps or causeways or just flat runways to get the towers as close as possible to the walls. And you ideally want to build enough of each that the enemy still doesn't know exactly where you're going to attack. So in my story, that's just what TP3 did. Because he not only understood all this, but he also understood the value of keeping his troops busy. Because bored troops are almost as good at finding trouble as 6-year-old boys. And remember, they were doing this work in the days before things like steel shovels. So a job that might take us a few days would probably take them months. But by 740 BCE, TP3 had a dozen siege towers, 2 of them equipped with rams, and 24 runways leading toward various sections of the wall. He lined these towers up opposite the most obvious points of attack against the wall, so his enemy could see exactly where he was going to be coming. And he left them there for 3 days, drilling his troops on how to get into the tower and climb up toward the breach quickly. Then, the night before the attack, he moved them to a different section of the wall. And as soon as morning started to lighten the sky, he launched his attack. First, he sent his archer teams forward. Assyrian archers, like their mounted counterparts, worked in pairs. But where the job of the second horse archer was to hold the reins of both horses, each foot archer had a counterpart with a big shield he used to protect the archer, as well as a spear to fend off anybody who had the bright idea to try and attack the archer while his attention was focused elsewhere. The archer's job was to keep the enemy archers' heads down while the push teams rolled the towers forward. And when the push teams had their towers in place, the main assault began. Troops surged forward into the towers just like they had rehearsed, exploding out onto the top of the wall and into the breaches their rams knocked in the towers, almost without resistance. Because the defenders inside Arpad had been on short rations for 3 years. They were probably eating about twice as much as the civilians, and even so, they wouldn't have been getting enough to stay healthy. They would have been sick by this time and exhausted and well on their way to severe malnutrition. The Assyrians were facing an outnumbered, weakened force that would have had a hard time repelling any kind of sustained assault by a fresh enemy that was getting enough calories. So this assault went about like you'd expect. Well before the middle of the morning, the Assyrians had the main gate open, and well before the middle of the afternoon, the last defenders were dead or surrendered. and the Assyrians went to work on the civilian population. Any city official would have been tortured to death, hanged from the walls, or possibly impaled outside the city. These deaths were public and brutal, not so much to intimidate the people of Arpad, they were already pretty much done, as to force anybody else who thought they could kick the Assyrians to think again. TP3 would have then sent teams through the city looking for folks with skills he needed. Smiths, weavers, herdsmen, tanners, potters, anybody with skills. These folks, as we talked about, would have been gathered up and probably fed, and they and their tools and probably their families would have found themselves bundled out of the city on the way to some other part of the empire. The rest were left to the tender mercies of the Assyrian soldiers. For 3 days, maybe a week, they would have had free reign of the city, killing and raping whoever they wanted, taking whatever wasn't nailed down, burning whatever they couldn't take. If there was booze in the city, they found it and drank it. If there was food, as unlikely as that seems, they found it and ate it. And many of those who were still alive at the end of the process would have found themselves dragged back to Assyria in chains, looking forward to a life of slavery to the guys who had just destroyed their home. The sack and destruction of Arpad was so complete that it's mentioned in the Bible, even though the Jews weren't even involved. It was not the last time TP3 would take an enemy city. He remained king of the Assyrians for another 13 years until 727 BCE, much of that time campaigning. But Arpad put the rest of Mesopotamia and the Levant on notice. The Assyrians were back, and they were not here to fuck around. No scorecard this episode. I pulled most of those details out of my ass, and we've already gone long enough. So if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And be sure to tell your nerdy friends about me. Until next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.